Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Bonsai Stuff podcast. As always, I truly appreciate you listening in. I'm Scott Martin from Bonsai Matsu. This episode of the Bonsai Stuff podcast, which is episode 14 for 2024. A couple of things I want to talk about in this one. One is I want to talk about one of the features of our bonsai that I love so much and the reasons why I love it, and that's the bark. And then I want to blend from that into talking about protection techniques for major bending, because the first thing that gets damaged when you're doing this stuff is the bark. So I want to talk about that as well in the podcast, because it's that time of the year where some major bending can occur. So I want to talk about the protection side. And then I also did a YouTube video recently with a juniper with this big ugly gin left hanging out one side of the tree. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I've had a lot of comments about it, which is awesome. It's created a lot of interest and a lot of debate about what people would do. And I just want to talk about my approach to Deadwood and how it's going to relate specifically with that tree in the future. So let's get into it. Tree bark. It is, in my opinion, the one serious factor that signifies age in our trees. We can style and shape and give the impression of age with our bonsai, but we can't force them to look old, and that's what bark does. Bark represents age in our trees. It's the only true thing that really is untouched by man. We can manipulate branches, we can manipulate foliage, we can pluck and prune and select what stays and choose what goes. We can put them in a pot a certain way. We can change the style of the pot that they're in to push them to give an impression that they're maybe older than what they are. But when it comes to true age of your bonsai, you cannot fake bark, no matter what you do. No matter what you think, you can't. And you can't rush it. There's no techniques. There are, if you listen to some of the older podcasts that we've talked about where, hitting trunk with a rubber mallet or using a drill to drill tiny holes in the trunk will help it to thicken up and callus and whatever else. But you just can't rush bark. It's just the only thing that shows that true age of a bonsai. And in my opinion, it needs to be protected. Once it's damaged, it can take a very long time to heal or grow back, if at all, at the same rate, because if one part of the tree's bark is damaged, then the bark around that area continues to age and get older, and the part that's been damaged obviously stays static. So I love it. As a tree lover, it is my number one on my favourites list. And it doesn't matter whether it's a bonsai or whether it's a tree that's growing in a park that I walk past. There's something about putting your hand on a tree and feeling it through the bark. And I don't know if it's just me that feels it, but there's something majestic in that you can connect with the tree through the trunk. Be very careful. You don't want to damage it when you touch it. And please don't touch anyone else's tree. Just stick to your own bonsai if you want to touch them. But for me, walking through a forest or a park or woodlands, whatever it is, and you come across something that's magnificent, the first thing that I'm looking at is the bark, is the trunk on this thing. And, it can be a smooth bark, it can be rough textured, whatever it is, but there's something about it that's just, I don't know, something special. And when you see lichen develop on that bark as well, that's taken a long time to get there. Lichen, it's not moss, it's lichen. It's something which takes a very long time to grow, and you only generally see it on really old trees, and it appears also on the old bonsai. Once they've been developed, and they settle and they get into the routine, we can develop our branches and ramification and structure and all that stuff, and then slowly over time, I love it when that little bit of lichen starts to appear. I've got a beautiful big banksia that it's got these big crackly thick chunks of bark down the base of it, and inside those little thick chunks of bark there's all this little lichen starting to appear, and it just, you can't beat it. You can't fake it, you can't rush it. You just have to wait. You just have to have a tree that's very old before all those things sort of start to line up, and it's it's truly to be admired, and it's just got to be so careful that it doesn't. I know I'm banging on about it, but you got to be so careful that you don't damage the bark on the trees, because once it's gone, that's it. It's stuffed. The bark tells a tale of where the tree started, where it came from. A lot of it's genetics. Often, you look at say pines, and some of the parent trees have got magnificent bark. Doesn't mean that the seedlings are going to have the same genetic quality, but you hope that when you take the seed from a parent tree that's magnificent like that you're going to replicate it again. Because it does it. And the bark, I liken it to like the wrinkles on someone's face. As they get older, then more and more wrinkles come. But those wrinkles are there from years of experience and joyous occasions where you've smiled so much that your face gets wrinkled. That's what I like to think anyway. Sometimes it's genetics, but I like to think that bark is like the wrinkles on our face. They tell a story and of great times and just where the trees come from and just protect it with everything you've got. Given I love bark on bonsai, on all trees. Secondly, we want to be able to manipulate or design or structure our bonsai to look the way that we want as part of our plan for the development of the tree. As part of that, one of the techniques that we have to do is some major bending. And one of the things, major bending can be done really well. And it's amazing to think when you see a major bend done on a tree, when you first start seeing it, it's like, that's impossible. That's not going to happen. There's no way that can survive that process. And lo and behold, with the correct techniques, they do. And it is all about the technique and the know-how. And it's something that you have to learn and something you have to have patience with. So don't just listen to this podcast and then jump out there and start snapping trees in half, because it's not going to work that way. There are definitely techniques to doing major bends with your trees. But one of the parts that I want to talk about through this podcast is the protection techniques, and just run through my process of how I do it. So if I've got a trunk that I'm going to bend, how do I make sure that I'm going to allow the tree to get to the next phase and start the healing process? Because it sounds terrible, but it's not. When you do major bends, you're often tearing fibre and you're ripping things, and you're not breaking them, but you're separating fibres on the branch, and then you'll need the tree to heal and start to grow and to move on. And then we talked last time about that the coat-it, the compartmentalization of decay in trees, right? What we want to avoid is for decay or fungal issues getting in, or water getting into these wounds that we're forcing on or inflicting on the bonsai. And we want to try and protect them as much as we possibly can. And one of the technique that I use, and I've used a couple of them. I've used different things like bike inner tubes, rubber wrapped around. I've used strapping, I've used, twine, I've used lots of different things. And for me, I just want to clarify that probably the best or the simplest and easiest technique that I like to use that's most successful, that's been really successful for me, is using raffia. Raffia is great. It's readily available. You can Google search and find it sort of anywhere around the world. A lot of craft stores have it, a lot of haberdashery stores, but you can buy specifically through bonsai stores as well, but it's pretty generically available, and it's nothing special about it. The ones they sell for bonsai is no different for the ones they sell for wrapping around presents at a local store. So the main thing with it is you want to get it in long strands. You don't want little short strands. You want really long strands with it. My technique with it is I take about 4 or 5 pieces of the raffia, separate them from they generally come in a big bunch. So you sort of unroll it and you pick out 4 or 5 pieces of it, get them to a common end, and then hold those all together and tie a knot. Right? So that way you're connecting about 4 pieces of raffia together. The reason for that is that when you put those pieces of raffia side by side and they overlap each other a little bit and they lay flat around the branch, you're getting something that's pretty wide, that's maybe not quite a centimetre wide, but it's getting close to being a centimetre wide. You don't want to use individual strands because there's no coverage and you're going to go round and round and round and round the branch, but you want to create like an artificial skin, if you like. So the process is take the raffia, 4 or 5 strands, tie a knot at the end of it where they're common length. I cut the scrap off past the knot so it's nice and neat. Then I take that raffia and I put it into water, submerge it in water for a good 10, 15, 20 minutes, however long you possibly can. The longer the better because you want the raffia to absorb the water. Then you work out when you make your bend, this is really important, where you're going to make your bend, where the pressure point is going to be, that's the point where the tear is going to happen. So you want to make sure that your raffia starts before that point. So at that tear point, you're not starting your raffia so it's going to sort of smudge off the edge of the tear, but the raffia is going to be wound over that part of where the bend is going to be made. So let's say it's at a branch junction. You might have it where you'll start the raffia up the trunk a little bit, sort of maybe a centimetre away from where the bend's going to be made for that branch, where the branch is actually going to tear from the trunk. Then work your way down the trunk and then around the trunk and up over the branch. So you're covering every single section of that branch right where the tear is with the raffia. Now, you don't need to extend the raffia a hell of a long way past where the tear is. It's just you want to have it focused right where that tear is. I've seen people that sort of raffia will protect an entire branch, whereas the point where they're making the bend, you probably only got maybe 3 or 4 centimetres that are potentially going to have tearing and exposure, which that's the only section that needs to be protected. And understanding that, the bark may get crushed underneath this raffia and whatever else, I try and minimise the impact that it's going to have. So I'll just cover off over where the wound is, then go past it maybe a couple of centimetres, pull that raffia around, tie a knot on itself, and then do it again, another knot on top of it. So it's really super tight. And that's the thing. When you put the raffia on, you've got to pull it as tight as you can. You want as much tension in that as you possibly can. And because it's wet, you'll find that there's a fair bit of give in the raffia. And that's why it's great, because it provides moisture to that wound, but as it dries out too, it compresses back in like a bandage and constricts that area and holds it all nicely together. The second thing that I'll do after I put the raffia on is I use some electrical tape. Nothing fancy, just bog standard electrical tape, and run it over the raffia. So I start just before where the raffia started, go all the way over the raffia, all over where the bend's going to be and the tear's going to be, and then just past the raffia on either side. So maybe by a centimetre either side of the raffia, which means that, and the reason why I use that electrical tape is, one, it's really easy to use. Secondly, it's cheap and convenient to find. Thirdly, it holds the moisture in really well. And that's what I'm trying to do. By putting on the raffia wet, then I put the tape over the top, I'm actually holding that moisture into that wound. Then what I'll do is I then heavy wire that section of the tree, get my steel bar if I'm going to make my bend with a steel bar or a jack or by hand or whatever it is, and then start doing the bend process. And I don't want to go into the bend process at this stage, but it's more the protection technique that I wanted to focus on with this podcast was raffia, wet raffia, strands of 4 or 5 knotted together in one point. Work your way probably a centimetre before where the tear is going to be, a couple of centimetres past where the tear is going to finish, then put electrical tape over it, starting a centimetre before and finishing a centimetre after where the raffia starts and stops, and then put on your heavy wire. Then you make your bend. I like using the steel bar, which, if anyone's seen anything I've ever done with trees with bending, I use it a hell of a lot. It's in my travel bag to go anywhere I go to demos or customers' houses. I've always got that steel bar in there because I was taught that technique. It's simple to do and really efficient too, because it sets the bend point exactly where the steel bar ends, so you don't get that flexing of the branch or that artificial loop of the branch. So that's pretty much the technique. The last thing that I'll do is often you're bending something that wire can't necessarily hold in place. So you're putting wire on there as a support for that area, but also to get a little bit of scarring as that wire cuts in a little bit on that branch. But the main reason I have it there is so I can use it to connect a guy wire. So I'll use raffia tape, heavy wire, steel bar for the bend. But before I finish the bend, I'll have a screw in somewhere low in the base, the nabari of the tree, hidden away between bark plates or under the soil level, whatever it is. I'll run a nice light guy wire from the screw up to the wire that I've put onto the branch that I'm bending. And as I bend down with the steel bar, the other hand will be taking up the slack on the guy wire and keeping it in position. And I find that pretty much protects the bark on the tree. It protects the branch from movement. I get a really efficient result when it comes to the healing of the wound that I've made as well, because that environment with the raffia generally is one that's like a Band-Aid situation for the tree. I do recommend not leaving the raffia on there for a massive amount of time, though. When I say that, maybe no more than a year, depending on how quick that tree is going to grow that you're working on. Because I've had it before where that raffia, the stronger raffia, can sometimes bite in like wire does on a tree as a tree grows. Instead of the raffia disintegrating and decomposing, it actually can bite into the tree. I've only ever had it happen once. Every other time I've had it, when I've taken that electrical tape off from around the branch, I've generally found that raffia inside to have disintegrated and fallen apart, and you just sort of scratch it off nice and easily. And there might still be an open wound there. You might find that the cambium or the new bark that's forming may be starting to roll back, but it hasn't completely done it. So it's really super important to understand that you've got to put some cut paste or cut putty into the tear that's there on the branch to stop that moisture getting in, to stop that decay. And then, like we talked about last week with wound management techniques, slides right into that because it's nothing different to that. But what you've got now is a branch or a bend or something significant that's happened with your tree. The wound's been protected. The tree has taken on its new form. It's taken a step forward on the plan that you've set for it, and you haven't lost any foliage. You haven't broken anything. You haven't damaged anything, and it's great. And it's really simple. It is something that you do need to practice. And when you're doing major bending, one of the things that I do is I listen and put my hand on where the bend point is and feel for tears, and you get a nous for it. You get a greater understanding. The more you do it, the more that you can sort of how far you can go with these things, and when you need to stop and rest and let the fibers start to stretch and then continue along that path. And understanding also the biggest thing is that when you do tear or when you do damage, you've got the measures in place that will protect it, and the tree can take that step forward and not go backwards, and your design process keeps rolling along, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so this juniper. It's a really nice tree. I love it. It's a really good video, and there was a major branch. Anyone who hasn't had a look, please jump on to Bonsai Matsu YouTube channel and have a look at the video that's uploaded for a juniper that's been redesigned. It's called Bonsai Transformation, I think. And you'll see that there was a pretty significant low main branch in the original design that I decided to remove the foliage and convert into a gin, or what possibly could be a gin. It could have been part of the process that it was removed. It could have been shortened at the time. It's great because it's created a conversation with a lot of people about gins and their thought on bonsai, and it's great. I love it. It's exactly why it was left there on the tree. And I wanted to talk in this section of the podcast about my approach to Deadwood, and more specifically why I think it's really important when you do create Deadwood to wait and not to rush into trying to get to that finished design that you want straight away. Bonsai is about the journey for me. It always has been, always will be, and I love it that I've got future steps on trees and future plans. Like that juniper, I've got repotting coming up, which is going to change the angle of it and get into a completely different pot and completely change it. I've got, some significant stuff to do with the Deadwood. There's possibly some more shari work. There's lots of development on the pads and all that stuff. And it's, for me, I'm not rushing to get there. So why I left that Deadwood there is I always prefer to start big with Deadwood. And anyone that's seen me do a demo with Deadwood, that's come into my workshop or done anything with me, will know my approach is to always make the gin as big as you possibly can, because you can always whittle it down. You can always reduce the size of it, but you don't get the option if you cut it off straight away. And you might know you're going to get there. You might straight away go, I don't want it. I want it to be like this. But I strongly encourage you just to hold fire for a little bit, let it dry out, and just keep your options open, because you're looking at the design of your bonsai or your tree right now. And what can happen is things change over time. Foliage mass starts to develop. It starts to get a lot bigger than what it was when you first made the design. So therefore, your Deadwood, if you'd whittle it down and made it a lot smaller, it may get lost. There may be no point even having it in the first place. Whereas if you've got it larger, you've always got the choice to, incorporate foliage going around that piece of Deadwood, and, the ugly part of the Deadwood that you don't like, maybe that can be tucked away and hidden, and then it's just a dead branch sticking out the middle of the foliage, which creates real interest. But if you remove it straight away, then you don't have that possibility. You just go to a design that doesn't have the potential for any other variables. And I'm a great believer that take your time, see what happens. You can always get rid of it later. As I say, it's bloody hard to put it back. But I always start big. And the second thing I do is I let it dry. If you've ever created a gin and tried to work it while that wood is still wet, it's impossible. Not impossible. It's awkward, and it doesn't give you the result that you want. It'll give you, a few fibers here and there gone, look a bit stringy. I almost guarantee that it's going to be a lot smaller than what you want it to be, because as you tear at that wet wood, it comes off in chunks, and it's not as controlled and not as smooth and not as elegant and refined as what it is if the wood's dry. So when I say let the wood dry, for me, it's, I'd think one full summer. If I can get that wood at any point through one full hot summer and then get to the cooler part of the dormancy, then I think that I'm pretty much set. But generally it's about a year for me, depending on the size of it. Sometimes smaller branches obviously dry out a hell of a lot quicker, but when it's a big branch, it's generally about a year that I try and leave it to dry out. But like I said, the main thing for me is really get through that summer. And when you look at the wood before you work it, next time, have a look and see if it's started to crack apart a little bit. Like if it's starting to really to dry out, you'll start to see the fibers starting to separate in different parts of that Deadwood, and that's pretty much a good signal that you can work it. If you're going to machine work the Deadwood with a tool like a Dremel or die grinder or something like that, you'll find that when the wood's wet, it sticks inside the cutting tool that you've got. So if it doesn't come off nice and smooth and powdered, then I think you'll find that you're possibly too wet with the wood. So using dry wood when you're using those machines, I find it comes away as dust, as powder almost, or fine shaving. So you're a lot more controlled in what you're doing with your wood removal, which is more specific to your artistic intent when you're creating a gin. Also, I find that when you use pliers to tear apart and grab fibres and pluck them away, it's a lot easier when it's dry, because you'll just grab individual fibres one at a time. Wet wood, you grab a fibre, you might rip a bunch off around it as well and end up with a big gouge out of the Deadwood, which you don't want. And one of the most important things that I like to do is to let that foliage develop. Wait until I've got a real sense of what this design's going to be. When you first create a tree, when you first design a bonsai, you've got a plan for it and you think, yep, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. But then, you never know, like a branch, you might have worked it too hard, that might die, or, something might happen to the overall design of the tree. One branch might get weaker for whatever reason and it doesn't end up flourishing like it should. So I like to keep my options open, and with the Deadwood, I develop the foliage first. I make sure I've got things pretty tied down as to exactly where the flow is and movement of the tree. and the weight of the foliage is, and then I can incorporate that gin to help me with that part of the design. If you jump into it too early, then, like I said, you're just removing something which could make your bonsai magnificent. It no doubt, whatever you're working on is going to be great. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be really nice. It's going to have a beautiful design. But by having that gin there right up until the very last point where you can go, you know what, I'm pretty certain if I reduce that down to about a third the size that it is, then, or I took the weight out of it and I made it a lot lighter and went for like more light branches on it rather than one big thick center core branch on this thing, then I think it would look nice as a point of interest, sort of counteracting that movement and flow of the tree. Can't do that stuff if you cut it off. And you definitely shouldn't be doing it when the tree's wet. I always wait with the Deadwood too for the wood to be dry before I lime sulphur. I don't want any of that lime sulphur sucking its way back through the heartwood, the wet wood, as the moisture withdraws from the tree. So I always wait till it's nice and dry before painting with lime sulphur. And before that point, you're really not going to get much bang for your buck by doing it anyway. So I just make sure that I've got the foliage developed. Then I can start working my scale of the design of the gin back, and then I can another thing with the gin, the length of the gin is make sure that you leave enough there, because as the wood ages it gets more brittle, and as it gets more brittle it'll start to break. So super fine gins might look really cool at the start of the bonsai design. Somewhere down the track, you might find that they break off, and that could be by rough handling, by accident, by bird, by whatever it is. I find that the really light, thin gins take a lot of care, and I always try and make them a bit bigger than what I'd intend, because over time they're going to naturally get smaller anyway. So when it comes to that juniper and the gin that I see in the back of my head, it's definitely something much lighter. It's way too wide. It's got to come in a lot closer to the trunk of the tree. It's got to be a lot finer, the branching structure on it. Maybe even some hollow in that wood that's left there as well to create a bit of shadow and a bit of interest. And it's probably going to end up being about a third as long as what it is now, and nowhere near as thick and heavy as what it is, because it's a bit overpowering, a bit distracting. So thank you for the feedback. If you haven't watched the video, jump onto the Bonsai Matsu YouTube channel and have a look and let me know what you think. Let me know what you do with it as well. All right, folks, I hope you found that an interesting podcast. Like I said, bark, you can't beat it. You've got to protect it and try not to damage it. And when we're doing these major bends, protect it too. Linking to last week where we were talking about the prevention of compartmentalisation, really trying to stop the tree from taking resources away from an area, protect the wound. And, when you're doing major bends, it definitely should be on the cards. You should have major bending in your toolkit for your own set of skills, because once you've done it and you get through that process and you get away from it being a scary, frightening thing, and you know how to look after these wounds that get made when you do the major bends, you can take your tree to a whole nother level. It's truly incredible, and it opens your eyes for a lot of different design possibilities for any trees that you have sitting on your bench, maybe that you look at and think, oh, that's too long, or I wish that went like this. Then, major bending, and using raffia to protect the trees is great. And like I said, there are plenty of other techniques to use, but I want to talk about the one that I use and that I know from my experience what I've done gives the best security to me to know that I can keep pushing the tree to the next level, knowing that when I do these things, it's not going to be at the detriment of the tree, which is the last thing I want to do. I don't want to hurt the tree. I don't want to damage the tree. I want to design a magnificent, beautiful bonsai, and this is one of the tools in my arsenal that I can use. And talking about the steel bar, when I was sort of jumping to the next section, I thought I've got to talk about leverage, because leverage is a great thing when you're making big bends, especially really, really big bends. The thicker the wood, the stronger it is, the more leverage that you're going to need too. So if you're bending something small, you can use a small steel bar. If you're bending something big, then you need a big steel bar. There's trees that I've bent with crowbar on it because the wood's so stiff and thick that you need that extension, that long leverage to be able to bend something into the right spot. So anyway, thank you for listening in. Thank you for sticking around. I do appreciate the patronage. You guys make it brilliant for me to sit here and record this podcast, and I can't tell you how excited I get when I have an idea pop in my head for the podcast. I've got a magic little book that I keep writing stuff into. I've got notes on my phone that I punch into, and my family now know that when I'm sitting there and we're post dinner and we're sitting on the couch and we're talking or whatever, and I suddenly race off and I grab my phone and I'm darting into it. My wife will turn to me and go, "Idea for the podcast?" I go, "Yep. Sure is." So thank you for listening. Thank you for your patronage. Thank you for the subscribers. I love you very dearly. Make sure that you're feeding your trees at this time of the year too. Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. It should be pretty much a good time to get into it and stink out the neighbourhood. So until next time, happy bonsai.